Welcome to Longevity Industries' presentation of the Destiny of Manufacturing podcast. I, of course, am Dean Phillips, and I am your host, and I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Precision Metal Forming Association and the PMA's Educational Foundation, for all of their help with this show. I'd like to introduce to you today from Audie Penn Consulting, Mr. Audie Penn, who is the managing partner of consulting operations. Welcome, Audie.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate it.
Well, it's great to have you here today. Thank you for taking time out of this COVID-19 hysteria, concern, all of the above.
Absolutely. It's a wild time.
It is a very different time we live in, and how we deal with things has changed so much and so dramatically. And I really appreciate you taking time to be here today. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
So right off the bat, what is your key takeaway for the destiny of manufacturing? What do you see coming down the road 5 years from now?
Well, there's a few things that seem to be on the surface as we are out with our clients. Obviously, we see the growth of additive manufacturing. I also like what I'm seeing with regard to the younger generation starting to see the importance of manufacturing and wanting to participate in that. And then you've got this whole COVID-19 thing that's really challenging us to examine the way that we look at our supply chains and our manufacturing space. So those things are going to come together to create, I think, a new view of manufacturing over the next 5 years. And I think we're going to see it strengthen in the United States. I was never one to buy into the whole service economy. I've argued against that for a long time, but I'm biased because I've been in manufacturing for 30 years. And realize that's where value comes from. I think we're going to return to that value-based manufacturing, at least a little more than what we are today.
Sure. And I agree with that. I think that a country without manufacturing isn't a great platform for stability in the long term. And I think you see a lot of that, especially now amidst this challenge with this disease, is that the hardest hit are those service industries.
Absolutely.
So tell me your background. How did you get involved in consulting, and in a broader sense, some of the things that you do, like lean and some of the additive processes?
Sure. So I spent a career, almost 30 years, in manufacturing in the United States with companies like Caterpillar, John Deere, Manitowoc Cranes, spent some time in the food manufacturing space, spent some time with Hahn in the office furniture space, and really have been involved in lots of different manufacturing processes over that 30-year span. But it wasn't until I got to Caterpillar when I really, I kind of consider myself a little naive about this, because I had been exposed to lean training in Six Sigma since the mid-'90s, but never really certified in any of it. It was just training that was provided by different companies. And so I had the knowledge, but was never really recognized as a certified practitioner. And then when I spent some time with the Caterpillar Production System group, it was a requirement for me to go through their internal training, but I also then was required to certify with the Society of Manufacturing Engineers and the Lean Alliance. And that's when it finally dawned on me. I've really got some skills and experience in this space, probably a lot more than I ever gave myself credit. And so I was fortunate in working with Caterpillar Production System, the global deployment team, to be able to practice consulting before I actually went out on my own. So for about the last 5 years of my time with CAT, I was a practicing consultant within the four walls of Caterpillar, and actually worked for a customer of Caterpillar's, and that's where I kind of caught the bug and it's been a great ride ever since I left in 2017.
That's great. Do you feel that your background has kind of given you a different perspective? Coming from manufacturing gives you, I think, a different passion. I would say, I know from my own background, is that when you're out with customers, the passion you have for manufacturing gives you a different perspective when you're out there. Do you find something similar to that?
Absolutely, and I'll share with you where it shows up for me. It's just being able to see the processes. I think a lot of people recognize the processes are around them, but when you're trained through those two different lenses of Six Sigma and Lean, you really have a totally different perspective about what process requires. And so that's one of the things that really surfaces for me when I'm out working with different clients is let's find out where your processes are breaking down so that we can get them to produce what you want. And that really comes from spending so much time in those manufacturing processes and learning. There's maybe one or two failure modes that are really significant. And if we can find them, we can fix them, and then we can move to the next failure mode. So that approach is actually applicable to any process, whether it's physical or transactional.
Mm-hmm. Do you what is the big challenges you see amongst manufacturers with seeing their problems? What are some of the things that you come across that are the challenges?
Well, I'll share a little story with you. I was on the phone with the CEO in the recent past, and we were actually talking about a very similar subject to your question. And I made a comment to him that just the phone went dead momentarily because of the power of this comment as it hit him. And my comment was this: I've never found a process problem that didn't have a people problem underneath it. And as he considered what I shared with him, he realized the truth of that statement. And the reason that that's so important to me is if we don't involve the people that are participating in the process itself, we'll never truly find the right solutions. And so there's a combination of very tactical, task-oriented work that goes on, but there's also an element of I like to use the word community, but it's interpersonal, it's relational work that has to go on as well, because until those two pieces come together, you're never really going to solve any problem.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And it's sometimes hardest to get the buy-in from people to understand the difficulties within their processes. And I think that's sometimes it's an institutional problem. Sometimes it's perception. I think there's so many different things that go into that between buy-in, understanding, comprehension, practice that lend itself to basically building a bad foundation. Is that how you would look at some of those things? Is that it's building a bad foundation to build upon?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that one of the key building blocks really is leadership. And I often will try to help leaders see themselves through either of two lenses. One is a coercive lens. I talk about coercion quite frequently because it's not successful or sustainable, or the influential lens, because that really is the only way to sustain improvements and find the best solutions, the most robust solutions. If you can influence your team members to participate and feel part of the community, you will learn so much more. And for me, that's that foundation that I think you're referring to, that quite often leaders show up with the wrong posture, and they are themselves the weakness in that foundation.
Yeah. Yep. Tell me what I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we spend a lot of time working with leaders in that space. We spend as much time in that community, relational, conversational space as we do in the application of lean tools and lean processes or Six Sigma tools.
Good point, because I think if everybody's not pulling in the same direction, you're not going to go very far.
Yes.
As far as influencing manufacturing and some of the reshoring that's going on, what is your take on that?
I think there is a belief that we have to break through. I share another story with you. I was talking to a VP of manufacturing at one of our clients, and we were actually talking about the impact of the pandemic and its disruption to the supply chain. And I made the comment. I said, I think there's one organization that will weather this better than others. And I mentioned Toyota, and he said, well, why do you say that? I said, Toyota has had a localization strategy for their supply chain for a very long time. And he said, tell me more. I said, well, when they go into a region, they're one of their first moves is to try and create a local supply chain. They would rather have a 12-mile supply chain than an 8,000-mile supply chain for logical reasons, right? I don't want 8,000 miles of bad parts headed my way when I realize I've got bad parts. I also want to be able to reach out and work closely with my suppliers on finding improved manufacturing processes or just sharing design information. And so I think their target is somewhere between 70 and 80% of their supply should be localized. And living through this current situation, a lot of people are coming to realize, oh my goodness, my supply chain strategy has really put me in a very risky position. And he asked the question, well, why do you think that is? And I said, well, one of the problems is we evaluate the purchasing function often, not everywhere, but I see it happen more often than not, and that is we evaluate the purchasing function on piece part cost rather than total cost of ownership. And when you add that supply chain impact in your total cost of ownership evaluations, you begin to realize this really isn't the best strategy for me. And so I think that's one of the learning points through this that will incentivize companies to evaluate their current supply chain strategies.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that, because I think a lot of companies have taken a page from that. Not enough, in my opinion. Not enough companies have, but a lot more over the years that have copied the Toyota production system have went that direction. I know when Volkswagen here in Tennessee opened their doors, that was their goal also, was to have between 50 and 75% of their supply chain within 100 miles.
Yeah.
And I think that makes things, it does a lot of different things. It gives it easy access to it. The transportation time, you can respond quicker to changes or needs based on that proximity. It's very difficult when you put something on a ship to make changes. It just doesn't lend itself to that. What do you think is some of the areas that we can improve in as far as like IoT strategies and things like that?
That's a great question. It's one that we're actually dealing with right now in my company. We've had a number of different AI big data companies approach us, 3 actually, and each one coming at us from a different angle, but for the same purpose. And that is what they're sharing with us is, Audie, we've got this huge ocean of data, and we're struggling to identify what is pertinent. We thought that we could analyze it, but what we've discovered is because of the individual adjustments to the process that are being taken with the objective of stabilizing the outcomes, we're not sure what data is pertinent, what data is real, what data has been modified or adjusted based on what an individual might think is required to be stable and successful in the outcomes. And the request that we have received is, you guys go in and analyze these processes to standardize processes for specific outcomes. If we could partner with you and you could help us see into that ocean of data a little more clearly, then we could actually use the different algorithms and processes that we've created to improve the design process, to improve the process management, and also then to improve the governance and predictive abilities, and communicate, say, to a process owner or a supervisor. You've got 20 minutes before your process reaches an out-of-control condition. We're measuring the right inputs. We can see what's going on in your process. You need to go to this location, and you need to work with that local team to make the necessary adjustments to keep your process operating the way that you expect it to. So we're working with these different AI companies to kind of clarify that data, to sift through it before they begin to put their IoT devices in place and monitor the performance and processes. So sometimes a lot of data isn't helpful until you can see into it the right way. The language that I use is, sometimes data is meaningless without some sort of context that you're able to view through.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've gathered data for a long time. Now we're getting better at it. And that's how I look at it, is we're finally understanding what we want to know. I think for too long we've had the opinion where the more data, the better. And if it's not the right data, I don't know that it's valuable.
I agree. And that's exactly what these different organizations are, I think, first admitting to themselves and then realizing we need people that do what my team does, to partner with them to help them get to that next level of value for their clients.
Sure. What about on the maintenance side of businesses? I know so often we get caught up into the value of data from the standpoint of things like production, those numbers. Mm-hmm. But where does things like maintenance and predictive maintenance specifically factor into that?
Well, for me, the whole maintenance piece pushes us right back toward the community idea. And I'll share with you a story from my Caterpillar days. I had an overhead crane that we needed to marry the upper frame and lower frame for hydraulic excavators. And it needed some significant maintenance. And I was surprised by the response of my maintenance partners. I mean, that's the way I looked at them when I asked if we could evaluate their process for repairing this. And you'll know where I'm going when I get there. They weren't used to that, because you kind of alluded to this whole idea of, well, we've got to protect the production output. Well, if I protect it too much and I neglect the equipment around me that is required to produce what I do, then I'm actually shooting myself in the foot long term. And so what we did was we evaluated the different phases of their repair process for this specific piece of equipment, and we devised a plan that would minimize the impact on our production. It didn't totally eliminate it. We couldn't find a way to do that, but it certainly minimized it by probably 80 or 85%. And so we didn't give up as much, but we also knew what we were giving up ahead of time, so we could adjust for that before we went into the maintenance cycle. And in the end, everything worked out perfectly. We were able to maintain our production position and yet get the complete maintenance process on the overhead crane conducted And we were right back in business after that. And so where I'm going is, until we create that understanding of community, that we all have a part of this, we can't just continue to push maintenance out. We have to invite them into the conversation and compare notes, basically, to say, well, here's what we need. What do you need? And when we can do that, you can create outcomes like I just described. We just need more of that going on in our organizations today.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, because I think when you factor it in a formula, people discount and only take into production from the standpoint of uptime, downtime, and they only look at it from the cost of we're not getting our parts out, but they're not looking at it from labor. They don't factor in all of the things that happen when a machine goes down. You have labor now that's not allocated in the proper way. You have the cost of expediting equipment. You have to look at outsourcing the product in many cases, because you don't have the machine time to do the parts that you need. So you wind up outsourcing it, shipping dies in a quick way. You're going to have more cost than what you just think of as loss of production. And do you see many companies understanding those numbers after you tell them, or is it something that they seem to be, it takes a light to click on in order for them to gather that?
I think it takes a light. You made a comment earlier as you were kind of responding to my comment about a formula. And the first idea that came to my mind was OEE, made up of productivity, quality, and availability. And understanding that maintenance practices has a huge impact on the availability piece is one area that we fight constantly. And it's not until we actually get people into the right conversation about, well, who influences each of these different areas the most and how does it impact our ability to actually produce, that we start to see glimmers of the light. But then it actually takes translating that into differences in the approach to maintenance before people start to realize. I mean, they've got to experience it for themselves before they truly believe the concept that we're trying to share with them.
Yeah.
And so the projects that we do are really meant to provide them with that experience.
I wish that it didn't require people to get to the pain level to realize the fact of the benefit of maintenance. I think too often it isn't until they feel the pain that they're like, oh yeah, that's a problem. But if you tell them in advance, so often people just don't understand it until it's like, oh yeah, this is a problem.
Well, and even sometimes when they experience the pain, they still want to blame maintenance, when ultimately the decision was yours as a production supervisor to either give up the piece of equipment strategically or to run to failure.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And I think that I've always been kind of bothered by pitting one department versus another, and it's a maintenance problem, it's a tooling problem, it's a materials problem, and instead of looking at it as a company problem and bringing all parties involved together, it's more of like, well, it's not my fault, so that kind of gets them out of it, and instead of working towards a common solution,
Yes. Yes, your common solution comment really brings to mind, I would say a story, but it seems to be the most common story that we run into, and that is our approach in taking the training concepts into actual application. We always work on bringing multiple functional groups together, and the very first phase of these projects is creating that common problem statement. Not it usually takes 2 or 3 different meetings before we can get all the blaming and venting out of the way and really get to the common conversation of, yes, if we solve that problem, it'll make my problem go away, and everyone in the room who represents different functional areas is able to say the same thing. When we get to that point, now when we solve that problem, everybody's happy and it benefits the whole organization instead of a single silo or a couple of silos.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think that too often we don't look to a solution that serves everybody. And that, because instead we're just feeding the monster that is productivity. And if that's the only thing you look at, it is very difficult to look beyond how do I maximize my OEE without sacrificing these other aspects. And, just pumping the machine out faster. If you can't handle the material, if you can't service the machines, if you can't make sure that this is going to be reliable day after day, year after year, and that those numbers fall into that Six Sigma category where it's consistent and not unpredictable. And I think that we suffer with that just too often.
Absolutely. And there are so many different reasons for approaching problems that way. We might be able to talk for the next 2 days about that one.
Yep. Hey, have you seen much of the things that are going on now with the disease going on with the COVID-19? Do you see some of the things where Additive is helping out by being able to produce masks, being able to produce these respirators? How do you feel about some of these opportunities that are being made available through Additive?
I think it's fantastic, quite frankly. There's a small group of people, and growing, that truly understand the abilities, the opportunities within Additive. And I think the more of these kind of stories that we see surfacing, the more people will pay attention to it. But I've been absolutely thrilled by the response of the manufacturing base that does exist globally, but I mean, even within the United States, to turn on a dime, to use the processes that they have available, Additive, certainly among those, to actually produce what is needed to save lives.
Yes. I've been very excited to see how some of the chemical companies that even were doing food processing switch to making hand sanitizers and doing other types of things like that. It is, from a manufacturing standpoint and from a just human side of it, it has been very impressive to see how people have banded together to change and shift directions to be able to serve the greater good. I've been very impressed with that, how it's been addressed. So I'm hopeful that we can keep doing that kind of stuff in our in our manufacturing world, because it does. I think it reflects well on us that we've done that very well. So, hey, Audie, I hate to cut you off here. We are at the end of our time. I'd like to ask you, how can people reach you?
You can look for us at either audiepenn.com or faro.partners on the web.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. And to listen to other episodes of this podcast, go to longevityindustries.com, click on the podcast, or go to your favorite podcast venue, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, radio, you name it. We're pretty much there everywhere. So thank you, everybody, and stay safe during this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.